So before we get started, I will give you the trigger warning of mentions of SA, okay? And I will give you a minute to scroll by before we continue. So we stumbled across the topic of the breeding of black women during slavery, and I think we're going to sit here for just 1 minute more, okay? Now, remember, we talked about the transatlantic slave trade ending, but in the United States, slavery was alive and well, right? Small FYI, the United States was really not all that heartbroken at the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. After all, it didn't really affect domestic slave trade at all, did it? No, no. But I digress. Yeah. Now, let's remember that enslaved people were treated like commodities. Yeah. They were treated like farm animals by enslavers, but they were crucial parts of labor for the production of the very lucrative cash crops, cotton, tobacco, and rice, right? So, enslavers set about passing laws to protect their financial investment. Yeah, that's what enslaved people were. They were seen as financial investments. Yeah. And let's not forget that enslaved people had no rights, right? Because in the Dred Scott case, we talked about that, yeah? The Supreme Court said that enslaved people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Yeah, okay? So let's not forget any of that, okay? So, how does that relate to maintaining a steady supply of slaves? Well, the Daughters of the Confederacy would have you believe that benevolent slave owners allowed enslaved women to choose their mates, or that they would encourage slave marriages, that they would give enslaved black women their choice of mates. Yeah. Um, Based off of what we just heard, does that sound right? Does it? Considering that black people were literally treated like farm animals. Does that sound right to you? Yeah. No, it's not right. It's not right. No. In actuality, slave owners bred black women like cattle in order to replenish their slaves. That's what we've been talking about, right? The historian E. Franklin Frazier, in his book, The Negro Family, stated that there were masters who, without any regard for their preferences of their slaves, mated their human chattel as they did their stock. Okay? Some enslavers promised enslaved women their freedom after they had produced 15 children. One slave trader from Virginia boasted that his successful breeding policies, those were literally his words, successful breeding policies, enabled him to sell 6,000 slave children a year. Enslavers would advertise like they did for breeding cows or mares in farm magazines. They shared tips with one another on how to get maximum value out of their enslaved women. They sold or lent enslaved men as studs, and they were known to lock teenage boys or girls together in a room. And those enslaved men that they lent or sold to be studs. They would lock them into rooms with enslaved women. And if they came back and the pair had not done what they were supposed to do, they were punished. And can you imagine what that punishment was? And I learned in my research that there were literally breeding farms, and their only purpose was to produce as many slaves as possible for the sale and distribution throughout the lower South. Two of the largest farms were located in Richmond, Virginia, and the Maryland Eastern Shore. And worse yet, as if it could get any worse. You know how there's a market for hairless kittens? There's a market for certain kinds of puppies. Where there was a market for dark-skinned slaves, obviously for field work. And there's a market for light-skinned slaves for housework. There was a market for fancies, which is a polite term for sex work. Countless escaped slaves wrote about their experiences in books called the slave narratives. We've talked about those. We've talked about Miss Rose Williams the last time we were together. She, along with other formerly enslaved women, they testified that slave women were subjected to essay, arranged marriages, forced matings, violations by enslavers, their sons, overseers. I choose to believe them. This is what happened to black women and girls.